Okay, I think it's all set up. So we ended here. We were talking about different kinds of ecological experiments. Observational, where nature kind of does the changing. You don't actually change anything. And then manipulative, where we actually make some kind of change, whether it's large scale, so in the field, or kind of tiny in a test tube, basically, or a flask. We talked about the pros and cons of each of those. They both have their place in ecology, or any science, really. So now I want to talk a little bit more about experimental design. Has anyone done research? I know some of you are doing some research. So you maybe designed some experiments or had help designing an experiment. I want to talk about the main parts of an experiment, and this will apply when we do our labs. We're basically going to sort of do, like I said, observational experiments. And there's certain pieces of an experiment that you want to take into account and incorporate in order to make it a good experiment where you get a legitimate answer. So we're going to talk about those pieces. You've probably heard of some of these. Generally, I would consider this just overall experimental design. There's a lot of nuance in how to design an experiment depending on what your question is. These are sort of general guiding principles and factors you need to think about. First, you have a treatment, and these are the terms I'm mostly going to use. There may be some other terms that you've heard depending on what system you're working in. But the treatment is the factor that you want to change or that you observe a change in nature. So this is the manipulated factor. It's easy to think about in a test tube. Maybe you change the amount of fertilizer that you add to water to see how algae grows. The treatment would be the amount of fertilizer. If it's an observational experiment, the treatment might be like rainfall over different seasons. You don't actually change that, but nature changes it, right? So whatever is changed in an experiment, that's kind of what you're trying to figure out. Does this treatment have an effect on your organism that you're studying or the habitat that you're looking at? And stop me if I'm not making sense with any of this, okay? This can be a little bit confusing. We're going to run through an example of how to set up an experimental design in just a second. So if these don't make sense, or if you're like, yeah, I get it, and then we set up the experiment and you don't really get it, I want to make sure we're all on the same page here. The control, kind of similar to a treatment, but you don't change anything. That's a good way to think about it. You reproduce everything in the experiment except for your treatment. You don't change it. It depends on how you set up your experiment as to exactly what your control is. If you're talking about adding fertilizer to something, your control might be don't add any fertilizer, right? So you compare your treatments back to the control to see if those treatments have an effect. A control is one of the harder things to actually kind of figure out, which seems, it might not make sense, but in some experiments, it's difficult to figure out what your control actually is, depending on your experiment. So reproduce everything but the variable that you're changing with the treatment. So you want the same amount of light, same amount of water, same amount of everything else, so you don't have another variable that you're not taking into account. Replication is critical. I think everyone kind of understands that. If you've looked at anything statistically, you have to have multiple replicates of each treatment and the control. So you have to replicate the whole experiment multiple times. Ideally, you replicate over time as well. So you don't just do it one time, you repeat the whole experiment with all of your replicates a second time or a third time. That doesn't always happen, and it's not always possible depending on your study system. But you have to have replication in order to do any kind of statistical analysis, which is the next part. Not the next part. Randomization is the next part. So randomization is where you randomize maybe the plots that you're looking at or how you set up your test tubes in the lab. This is inherent in any statistical test. It's assumed that you've randomized your treatments and your controls. So that might mean where you place the test tubes in the lab, or if you have them all kind of in a test tube rack, you're not going to add the same amount of fertilizer to one entire row. You're going to totally randomize where you add those different levels of fertilizer. This limits the bias and can help capture variation. So randomization is critical. And we'll be applying all of these in lab. And then the next one is analysis. You have to analyze what you're finding, right? If you collect data and it seems to be going in one direction, say more fertilizer means more plant growth, you still have to do a statistical analysis of that. Because if there's a lot of variation, that might actually swamp any real difference. So we'll use statistical tests to either support or reject our hypotheses. And again, that's analysis includes or assumes every statistical test is going to need some kind of randomization in the experimental design, that's assumed. And you have to have replication. You can't do stats on something where you don't have replicates. You have to have typically at least 3. That's the goal. Okay. So based on those, now I'm going to have you guys design an experiment, a simple one. We good? I don't want to go too fast. Okay. So pair up, work with someone else. It can be a group of 3 if there's an odd number in here. That's totally fine. You're going to design a really simple experiment, including these elements that I just talked about, looking at how fertilization is going to affect tree growth in a block of wood. So imagine going out somewhere on campus, you're looking at different levels of fertilizer. Does that increase plant growth, tree growth, or does it not? That's kind of the question. Tell me what the treatments would be, the control, how you'd replicate it, how you'd randomize it, and then generally how you'd analyze it. If you can't get this, that's fine. If you don't have the analysis understanding yet, that's fine. But I think hopefully you can figure out these top 4. So come up with that, and then we'll sort of draw it out on the board. We'll diagram it. So take 5 to 7 minutes to do that, and then we'll come back together.
Got that? Oh my gosh, very hard.
All right, and Katie, if you want to try, feel free, but we'll be writing the answers up here as well.
So the control would be tree fertilization.
We did for types of fertilizer, we could do the amount.
So I would say randomization is that we like which tree, randomizing which trees get fertilized and which don't.
You would have like a grid system, and you would be like, oh, be this one, this one, this one, and this one. Yeah, this is a. But they're like, they're all random, you know, like you have like.
You write the analysis.
You have.
I don't know it.
Like, you draw lots, right, and then you're like,
So analysis would be like
different answers.
watching, plotting the tree growth over, like say a 6 month period. And like,
So that you can also have like randomization in one of the
yeah. And according to data.
with the analysis as well. If you could like,
We need to.
you know, if you had like the overhead, you know, pictures of what's every single one.
This is an iPad.
And then like you compared like, I don't know how you would answer that. Because it would all be visual, so it would, there would, I mean, but you could like compare like the shades.
What you need to do is watch the block sales so the wall break. All the once it gets where the price point is somewhere else, the target,
So does it
like you can price match
account
everywhere.
for like dead trees? Like dying plants?
My lines check.
Because like it's also not.
I didn't look every single time I got a very good figure out last semester that I did my line check. I would have a
You
lot of
know,
money. I got a lot of emails from Tracy. I remember once I got one that was like, you, I was reading like multiple emails and you were on the list. And I emailed you back and I was like, this is the first call today. And she was like, "Gee, sorry to be mean." Okay, girl. Oh, that's like the glass half waters. I never really understood.
All right, so wrap up your discussions and we'll kind of as a group design this experiment up here on the board. Did you guys, you have all those? I'm gonna take this away. So we're looking at tree growth.
Jeffrey's really lopsided.
I know it is, and it cuts off on the bottom. It's easier than, I don't know if there's a mute. Ah. It's the sound. Usually that takes the light away. Oh, well, here, we're just gonna have the light there. All right, so we're looking at tree growth in a block of woods based on fertilizer, right? So the first element, I'm just gonna draw out our woods. So let's imagine we're somewhere on campus and we have multiple blocks of woods we're looking at. That's kind of big. Let's make it smaller, so more. This block, this block. Okay, so those are blocks of woods. Here we go. So what would our treatment be? Who wants to throw out an idea of a treatment? What would we change between these blocks of woods that we're looking at?
Fertilizer.
Right. What about the fertilizer? Because I heard a couple different good ideas, actually. Type of fertilizer, amount. Yeah, so you could do either, right? I didn't really say which one. So we'll have all these blocks. It can be different sizes. It doesn't really matter. So our treatment is going to be, we'll make our treatment, we'll just say amount of fertilizer for now, okay? But it could be type, that's totally fine. So treatment That's gonna be amount of fertilizer. So we'll say we add whatever the units are, we'll say like 1 ppm, 2 ppms, or 3, right? So we'll see what effect, that just stands for parts per million. We'll just imagine it as a general unit. So we're gonna add 1, 2, or 3 more fertilizers, right? So that's gonna be our treatment. We'll have 3 treatments. So that means we have 3 treatments, 1, 2, and 3. What would our control be?
The block without any.
Yeah, just don't add any. So that's an easy control. No fertilizer. Just as the woods are growing, the block of trees as they're growing naturally, right? So we're going to compare each of these back to the growth for adding no fertilizer. What was the next aspect I had? Replication?
Good.
Okay, so how would you replicate this? If you were to design this, you have 3 treatments, you have 1 control. How would we replicate it? Would we need just 1 block of 1 ppm plus 1 ppm?
You'd have multiple blocks of each treatment,
And
the control.
control, right, exactly. So let's see, I might have made too many treatments here. 1, 2, so that would be, how many of these would we need?
2.
I would say 3 of each even, so 9, yeah, but, so 3 of each of these, and then 3 controls. So that's gonna be 9, 12, that's too many. So we're gonna get rid of 1 of our treatments, just to simplify things, yeah. So now we'll have 6. 6 of our 3 of each of these, right? So we'll put times 3 for our replicates. And then times 3 of those. So we need 9 total blocks. What do I write? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we'll do 2 more blocks. 8, 9. So these are our 9 blocks that we're going to use. Okay, so that's our replication. I'm not going to write what the treatment is in each of them yet, because that's where randomization comes into play. So how would we generally randomize this?
Flip a coin.
You could flip a coin, yeah. You could pick a random number from a list. Excel will do random numbers, and you can just pick based on a grid. I think I heard you guys talking about a grid. So you could set up a grid and decide exactly where you're going to put those blocks. So I already drew these up here. But if you have a big block of woods, if you decide, you know, every 10 meters you're going to put a block, then you would alternate how you're going to add the treatments, right? So we're going to just kind of randomly put them in here. There's technically very specific ways to be random, which sounds weird. I'm going to do more of a haphazard, just throwing them up here. So we'll have our 3 1 ppm treatments. We'll put 1 here. So +1, +1, +1. So we'll say that's fairly randomized. And then we have our +2 treatment. So we'll do +2, +2, +2. And that's going to leave our 3 controls, right? So control, control, control. That's fairly random. And when we do stuff in lab, we're sort of just going to be more haphazard, which is a technical term. But we'll consider it random. So we randomized it. The reason you do that in a block of woods, if you put all of the controls right here, they might get more sun naturally, right? And then that is going to throw off, it's going to make it look like maybe the controls actually grow faster. If there's more sun than say there is over here. So we've randomized it. What's next?
Analysis.
Analysis. So yeah, generally, how would you compare? You can give me a stats test if you want to, but you don't have to. Any ideas there? How would you, well, what are we measuring?
Tree growth.
Tree growth, right? So how would you measure tree growth?
You would take an initial reading, or like the height of the tree, and then like every month or every week you would go out and get the height and measure the growth.
So you got to figure out what you're measuring in order to figure out what data you need to take, right? So we'll say height of tree. It could be diameter. We'll look at DBH, which is diameter of breast height, which is a good way to measure overall tree growth. This will be over a long period, right? If we're talking about fully grown trees. So height of tree is what we're measuring. So we'll say we measure height of tree every, 6 months or something like that and see how it changes. So the height of the tree is the data that we're collecting. So if we look at the height of tree, how would we know if the +2 fertilizer is having a greater effect? What would you compare it to?
Average.
Yeah, you would average, exactly. So we'd average, say, these 3 + 2s, right? That's what a statistical test will do for you. So we'll have average of control, average of the +1 treatment, and average of the +2. So if we needed to say, if we wanted to see if the +2 treatment showed greater tree growth, what would we compare it to? The control or the +1? Well, you could compare it to both. Yep. So you would compare it to the +1 and you compare it to the control. So then you could say adding 2 ppms of fertilizer, if it shows a greater increase in growth than +1 and control, then you know that the +2 has a greater effect. It may not show a difference between the 2 and 1, but it may show a difference between the control and the 2. So comparing all of them is ideal. This would be basically a test called an ANOVA, which is analysis of variance. You don't need to know that right now, but if you have 3 groups that you're comparing, you can compare the average really easily and see if there's a difference between 2 of the groups, between all of the groups, and where that difference actually falls out. Okay. Nice job, guys. You designed your first experiment. Any questions about that? All right. So those are, like I said, the elements. If you get that, then you'll understand kind of what we're doing in lab pretty well. And a lot of the sort of more classic experiments that I'll talk about, all of these were included. So I'll go through, when we're talking about these more general theories that have been developed in ecology, they were all developed using this general experimental design. Okay. Another thing to take into account is the study scale. So the scale can vary a lot in ecology. We can be looking at, from a spatial standpoint, this is just, a unit of area. We can be looking at plant root hairs. So there's these little hairs on roots. We can look at those and what microbes are on them. That is an extremely tiny scale. We can look at whole ponds. So pond communities. Pond can be kind of small or pretty big. Or we can scale it up to entire continents. If we're looking at songbird migrations from, say, the Great Lakes region down to South America, that is a much different scale. All of those require alterations to your experimental design, obviously, but spatially, it's important to realize kind of what you're looking at. We were looking at blocks of trees in the woods, say around campus with our last example. It could be, the state of Georgia overall tree growth versus the state of Alabama or something like that. So spatial scale matters a lot. Yeah. And then also temporal. Anytime you see the term temporal, that means time. Temporal changes can be, again, really small scale, so seconds to hours. If you add a toxin to a fish tank and see what happens, it could be seconds, maybe where the toxin has an effect, maybe hours. You can look over years. So if a species is in decline, say a butterfly species, generally you want to look at that over years. You're not really going to see a difference necessarily within a year, but across years you might see differences. Seasonal differences are used a lot as well. So winter versus spring, etc. So that's an important temporal scale. And then you can also look over centuries. So how a plant community might shift in its species makeup, that's going to take a really long time, typically. So that might be over centuries. And obviously no one's alive for centuries at a time, but we can look back at previously collected data and look at how climate may have affected changes in plant communities. All right, so just one other factor that we didn't really talk about, temporal scale and spatial scale. But ecological studies are done at all of those scales, both time and space. Okay, that wraps up what I wanted to wrap up on Tuesday. So now we're caught up. At the end of every chapter slideshow, I'll have a slide like this that kind of includes the concepts you should be familiar with and then the terms. Kind of like a mini study guide, I guess. You can put all these together by the time the exam comes around, and hopefully it'll help you kind of focus what you need to study. Okay, questions before moving on? That was all like really basic kind of intro stuff. We're going to get into actual environmental stuff next. Share that. Okay. Great. So that was kind of chapter 1 of the book. I split chapter 2, the physical environment, into 2 separate. I have an A and a B because there's a lot of information in here. So this will get through most of it today, I think. We'll see. But we'll be talking about the physical environment, not including really any biological stuff until a little bit later in the semester. So we're going to talk about how the environment can affect overall habitats, basically, to start with. You may have heard some of this in other classes. Some of it might be a review, some of it will be new. So we will jump in and just look at variability and factors that affect the physical environment, starting with overall the global climate system. So we're starting a really large scale. So we're talking how climate is affected over the globe. Everyone knows latitude and longitude, right? So latitude, we measure, it's like a ladder, you can step up, right? Latitude. So that's measuring north to south, longitude measuring east to west. I'm not really going to focus on longitude as much because it has less of an effect on the ecology of an area. It obviously changes around the globe. Latitude has a huge effect. The equator, the climate of the equator is very different from the climate at the poles, right? So the further away you are from the equator is going to change the climate and what lives there. So latitude has a lot more of an effect on the organisms and the habitat of an area. So there's a difference between weather and climate. I think this is more commonly talked about now. Does anyone know what the difference would be? If you were defining, you don't even have to give me a great definition of weather or climate, but what is generally the difference?
Weather is more like a day-to-day, like a single location, like Everest.
Mhm.
And climate would kind of be more of larger geographical areas, like the state of Georgia, or like the Southeast.
Okay, so you're saying more area.
Yeah.
Okay. So it could be area. I like the small versus large aspect. Anyone else? Yes.
Would the climate like change over time, kind of?
Mhm.
Long period of time?
Long period of time, exactly. So weather can be changed over time, but weather is more small scale. Yeah, so not necessarily area, but time wise. So weather is maybe one spring season. Climate is really long-term changes. So climate, long-term averages, I would say, of the weather. Weather is kind of a moment in time. Is it a hot summer? That's the weather. Are summers getting hotter every year? That's climate. So weather would be environmental conditions at a point in time. Climate would be more averages over multiple years. So this is why, you know, particularly hot summer or a particularly cold winter can't really tell you a lot about climate change, right? Climate change is really large scale over a lot of time. So it's dangerous to assume that one season indicates that climate change is going one direction or another. Okay, so we're mostly going to be talking about climate. We'll talk a little bit about weather, but most of our focus is climate because we're talking kind of large scale with ecology. Solar radiation is driving the global climate system. If we break it down to what is actually changing the climate, it's the sun. If we didn't have the sun, we wouldn't have the climate patterns that we have. So it all comes down to solar energy driving the global climate system, and I'll show you and talk about next kind of what I mean by that. If we look at the energy sort of coming in versus what's reflected out or absorbed by us on the ground, we can break it down into these kind of general categories. About a third of the solar radiation coming in, this is a percentage, so we have 100% coming in. 32% of that, about a third of it, is actually just reflected right back out. So a third of it doesn't even make it down to us. It's reflected by clouds, aerosol particles, atmospheric gases, and then also by the surface. So it makes it down, but then gets reflected right back, basically. So nothing actually uses about a third of it. Half of it is absorbed by the surface. That could be absorbed in the water by organisms, plants, etc. And some of it is absorbed in the atmosphere. So 20% of it's absorbed in the atmosphere. So there we go. There's the numbers. Sometimes I forget what I've actually written on these slides when I have animations that make them pop up. So a third is reflected back, a fifth is absorbed in the atmosphere, and then half of it makes it down and is absorbed on the Earth's surface. So here's something to think about. Not anything I'm going to go into too much detail about, but if we had more aerosol particles in the atmosphere, what would happen to the energy input to the surface? We have more or less energy input if there's a lot of aerosol particles up here.
Less.
Yeah, less energy is going to make it to the surface, right? So what we put into the atmosphere, I think everybody knows, obviously has an effect on the solar radiation coming in. Aerosols, I think back in the day, probably got a little bit more attention, but we still have plenty of aerosol particles, and they're actually reflecting, they're causing greater reflection back out into the atmosphere. So that's something to think about in the global climate system. We're not going to go into a whole lot of detail right now about human effects on that. Again, that's more kind of environmental science, but definitely something to consider as we talk about how the global climate system functions, how we're affecting it. Okay, so if the climate's stable, if we want the climate to be stable and stay the same for many years, the energy input has to equal the energy output, right? That's just simple math. We can't have more energy coming in or less energy coming in than the energy that's leaving and being reflected. So we always have the same, more or less, the same amount of sun coming in, right? It changes based on the season. We don't have as much sunlight in the northern hemisphere this time of year. There's three ways that heat is generally lost. So the first is latent heat flux. Latent just means basically evaporation. So evapotranspiration, so evaporation from the surface as well as evaporation from plants. So we lose heat just by the evaporation of water. That's latent heat flux. There's also sensible heat flux. which sounds weird, but it's just conduction and convection leaving the surface. So that would be winds kind of moving heat away from the surface or organisms releasing heat themselves. And then we have the more complicated side of things, the long wave or infrared radiation. So this is something we don't think about, we don't see, we probably don't think about latent or sensible heat flux either. But the long wave radiation is sort of the more complicated piece of the equation. So some of it is lost and some of it is re-radiated back down. So this is, when you think about radiation, it's just energy. This is long wave, so we don't really see it. It's not visible to us in any way. Some of it is, we emit a lot of it from the surface, right? A lot of it is re-radiated back down to the surface from the gases and particles in the atmosphere. And a lot of it actually just leaves out through the atmosphere. And that's a huge part of the loss of heat from the Earth. You can see the numbers here. Small amount from latent and sensible heat flux. Most of it is leaving from this long wave radiation. If we have more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we lose less of this, so this number will go down and we hold on to more heat. That's the basics behind the effect of greenhouse gases on our climate. How are humans altering this equation? What are we doing? Everyone knows this. What are we releasing? What's one greenhouse gas that you know that we release?
Carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide, that's one of them. I'm going to write down the main greenhouse gases and how we're affecting this reduction in outgoing long wave radiation just through our actions. So CO2 is the most well-known greenhouse gas. Carbon dioxide, right? There's three others technically. I'll write them all down and then circle the ones that have the most effect. Does anyone know another greenhouse gas? You guys heard of anything else?
Methane.
Methane's a big one. CH4. The other two really don't get talked about that much. One is pretty minimal in its effect. Another one has a huge effect. It's not really seen as a bad thing. Any other guesses?
Water.
Water, nice, yeah. H2O. There's a lot of water vapor in the atmosphere. It's a greenhouse gas when it's in its gaseous form. One more. Anyone know the last one? This one's tough. N2O. We won't really talk much about that one, but these are the four main greenhouse gases. It's weird to think about water as a greenhouse gas, right? Yes, methane and carbon dioxide we think of as greenhouse gases. Water actually has more of an effect than these others at bringing the outgoing long wave radiation back down, reflecting it back down. So this has the most effect. It has the most effect on the re-radiation back down of heat to the Earth. Water does, sorry. N2O, sorry. So we don't want to decrease the amount of water we're putting in the atmosphere, right? That's not something we're going to change. We have the amount of water that we have. So this isn't one that we focus on as wanting to bring down. CO2 and methane and then N2O to a lesser degree are, right? Because these are released by us. This is just a natural part of the cycle. Water is keeping us warm. Water in the atmosphere is keeping us warm. CO2 has the next biggest effect, right? Yeah, CO2 is number 2. Methane is number 3. This is overall reflection of radiation back down to the Earth. There is a ton of water in the atmosphere. There's a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. There's not a whole lot of methane in the atmosphere, but it is a really effective greenhouse gas. A little bit of methane does a lot of re-radiation back down to the Earth. So we definitely want to decrease the amount of methane It holds on to heat really well and reflects it back down, even better than carbon dioxide. We just don't release as much of it. Okay. So these numbers, water, then CO2, then CH4, is just the amount of effect it has on this re-radiation back down to Earth. Questions about that? Okay. So let's talk more about solar energy and how solar energy really drives this change in climate over the latitudes of the Earth. A lot of it comes down to how intensely sunlight is absorbed and hits the surface of the Earth. So we know the Earth is on a tilt, right? It's not directly upright. So we're kind of tilted. No matter what time of year it is, if you look at the amount of sun hitting near the equator, the amount of sun hits at over a much smaller area overall. So it's a sort of higher angle. It's a 90-degree angle, more or less. Up in the northern hemisphere, this would be winter. So this is kind of where we're at. Sunlight is actually spread over the curve of the Earth. So the same amount of sunlight coming off the sun is spread out. That's why it's typically year-round a lot hotter near the equator than it is in the northern or southern hemisphere, the further away you get from the equator. It all comes down to geometry. It's just, you spread out the sunlight a lot better around the curve of the Earth when it's tilted away from the sun versus near the equator, it's just hitting kind of straight on. So the equator gets a lot more energy than we do. And that is reflected in this average. This is the average annual temperature across the globe. Obviously in the middle, it's hot. As you get away from the equator, it gets cooler, right? That is probably not news to anybody. And that brings us into how this affects general climate patterns as we move across these sort of large scale latitudes. This is going to deal a lot with precipitation. So Hadley circulation. Has anyone heard of the Hadley cells or Hadley circulation? Okay. So this is where we get a little bit complicated, the Hadley cells and then the Coriolis effect. So I'm going to try to slow down and explain this as best I can. And if you are confused, please stop me. How much time do we have? Okay, sweet. So the Hadley circulation is going to drive these bands of really wet areas and really dry areas across the globe. So I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but most of the world's deserts are found around 30 degrees north and south. The rainforest, most of the tropical rainforests are found around the equator, right? So the equator is really wet. Once you get out to these 30-degree latitudes, you have a lot of deserts. It's a really dry latitude. And the Hadley circulation is what drives that. So I'll talk about what that means in just a second. All right, before we get into what the Hadley circulation does, there's a few terms that we'll be talking about, basically how air moves and how water moves in the atmosphere. So first, atmospheric pressure. Does anyone know generally what atmospheric pressure is or where it's higher or lower? Is there more atmospheric pressure on the ground or say 30,000 feet in the air? On the ground, but thank you for answering. So atmospheric pressure, the easiest way to think about it is the pressure of the atmosphere pushing down. So we have a lot of pressure actually pushing down on us right now, just from the air above us. The further up you go, there's less air and less atmospheric pressure. So when you go up in an airplane, that's why the cabin is pressurized. They need to add that pressure in, otherwise there's not enough pressure for us to actually survive. So it's the more atmosphere there is above us, the more pressure is being pushed down on us. So it's pressure from the air above, the atmospheric pressure. It's going to decrease with altitude. So as you go up a mountain, up into a plane, There's less and less pressure pushing down on you or on the air. Uplift is just the concept behind warm air rising. Warm air rises, subsidence, cold air falls. I think most people understand that. If you have your heat on in your house, a lot of times it's warmer on the second floor, right? Because that hot air is rising up and it's cooler on the first floor. Same idea in the atmosphere. So where you have hot air, it's rising up, that's uplift. Where you have cold air, it's going to be falling back down to the earth. That's subsidence. What's that? Yes, uplift is warm air rising. And subsidence is cold air falling. So those are really key concepts into how this Hadley circulation works. Warm air is always going to rise, like you see here. Cool air is always going to fall back down. Cold air is denser, warm air is less dense. It all comes down to just density differences. Okay, so what are clouds made of? What are clouds? Water. They're just water, right? Clouds are just water. So you have warm air rising up. When it gets up high enough, it cools down. So it gets colder as you go up as well. Warm air is going to rise. It's less dense, but it still has water vapor in there, right? So it's rising up. Clouds form when that air cools down and starts to condense back towards a more visible water vapor. So it's water vapor that's condensed. So cloud formation occurs where there's a lot of warm air rising. If you have a lot of warm air rising, it's bringing water vapor with it. That water vapor condenses back down to, well, a little bit closer to a liquid and eventually rains, right? Where you have clouds, typically you have rain. That's just because the water vapor has condensed up in the upper atmosphere. Not upper atmosphere, but up in the sky. So that kind of goes back to chemistry. As something gets cooler, so like water in this case, if you have gaseous water, right, you have water vapor, when it gets colder, it condenses back into liquid. That's why clouds form, and that's why you get rain. Okay. Ready to move on? All right, so what are these Hadley cells and Hadley circulation? We're talking really large scale here. So large scale patterns that result from this uplift and subsidence. Uplift of air and then the falling back of the air to the earth. I'm gonna wait a minute while y'all write because I don't want to jump in too quickly. If you miss the beginning of this explanation, it can be really confusing from here on. Okay, so at the equator, like I showed you a couple slides ago, there's really intense solar radiation, right? It heats up the earth very quickly. There's a lot of energy coming into the equator. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to start at 0 degrees. So that intense solar radiation is heating the air at the equator. So what does hot air do? It rises. So it comes off of the surface of the earth. That's what these arrows are showing. So that hot air is rising. When it rises, what does it do? Yeah, it cools down and forms into a cloud. You get a lot of rain falling from that. That's why the tropics are so wet. You have all that radiation heating up the air rises, forms clouds, those clouds create rain. That's the reason why you have tropical rainforests in the tropics. Okay, so we got the rain aspect at the equator. We're going to continue on. So this air is going to rise. It's going to release a lot of moisture, right? It's going to release most of its moisture at the equator. But then it gets pushed out of the way, north and south, because there's constantly more air rising. So there's more air taking its place that pushes the dry air. Now that it's released all of its water, the dry air is going to flow north and south. It's just getting pushed out of the way because more air is coming up. So air is getting pushed out of the way. It then cools even further and eventually falls back to the earth. So this cool, now dry air, because it's released all of its moisture at the equator, falls back down to earth at about 30 degrees north and south. That's where you get the deserts. So you have a lot of dry air falling back down at this 30 north and 30 south latitude. It's not releasing water. The air released all of its water pretty much at the equator. Okay, so we're at the deserts. There's cool, dry air falling back down. It's cool because it's been in the atmosphere, right? It's really high up, so it's cold. So it's falling back down. And then just like at the equator where more air is moving up and pushing this air out of the way, when more air continually falls down, the air at the surface gets pushed back towards the equator or the other way. This is just showing one direction. So it also gets pushed out of the way and goes back towards the equator or 60 degrees north and south. So it has to move out of the way to make, we don't really think of air as taking up space, but it does. It gets pushed out of the way. So that creates these cells of kind of rotating air. So you have that general pattern, and we're going to focus on equator to 30 degrees north and south. I'll show you some other cells further up and down in a little bit, but these are what's driving most of the climate within this 30 degree or 60 degree latitude change. The low pressure, high pressure that's listed here. The equator, so when it rains, do you generally know what kind of pressure there is? Like a low pressure system brings what, sun or rain?
Rain.
Rain, yeah. If you have a low pressure system coming in, that's going to bring rain. So low pressure, lots of rain at the equator. It's low pressure because the air is leaving, right? There's not air pushing down. Here you have high pressure because air is coming down from above and pushing down. So you have high pressure at the 30s and low pressure at the equator. So that's the high low here. Obviously, this doesn't determine exactly what the climate is all across 30 degrees north and south. There's other things coming into play, but this is generally kind of the overall driver of precipitation between the equator and 30 north and 30 south. Okay, questions about that? So if we look at it from the side, we're kind of looking at a Hadley cell. We're going to start at the equator and go up to 30 degrees. Solar inputs at the equator. This is just a different view. It's a little bit easier maybe to understand. You have a lot of sun coming in. You have that warm, moist air rising, expanding, cooling, causing rain. That air is then forced north and south. So it's going to, in this case, we'll imagine that's 30 degrees north. So we're going into the northern hemisphere. It's going this way because we continually have more air flowing up and displacing it. So then at 30, falls back down. It's cool, it's dry. Deserts are hot, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that deserts are going to be cool, but the air is cool, so it falls back down. It's dry because it's released all of its moisture basically at the equator. And then it's going to move back towards the equator. So you get dry conditions at 30, that dry air is moving back across the surface and picking up moisture. So it picks up more moisture as it moves back to the equator. So you get this rotation of air that we can't see and don't ever think about, but this is what's driving those precipitation patterns. All right. This goes beyond just the 30 north and 30 south. And you can see within here, there's more fine-tuned changes that happen. I'm not going to go into exactly how that happens, but like I said, it's not just at 0 degrees, it's really wet, and at 30 degrees, it's really dry. There's a lot of other stuff coming into play. They can kind of be predicted, but it gets more complicated than I think we need to go into. So there are other cells, as you can see. So we have the Hadley cells. Those are specifically around the equator to 30 degrees, Hadley cells. The other two major circulation cells are the polar cells. Those are the poles. That's easy to remember. And that's where cold air is falling back down, cold, dry air. So the poles are really dry. There's a lot of snow, but it's just because it never melts because it's freezing cold. They don't get a whole lot of precipitation. And then in the middle, you have the feral cells. And these two in the middle, so the polar cells kind of drive them, the polar and the Hadley cells drive themselves. The feral cells are kind of just a result of these two, the polar and the Hadley. So we are, I think we're 34 degrees north in Demarest. So we're 34, that's our latitude. So we're kind of almost on the border of a feral and a Hadley cell. We obviously don't live in a desert. A lot of that's due to more local climate conditions. But yeah, just for reference, we're kind of right here, right on that border. Okay. So wet and dry systems. Where are the world's deserts found? You had to choose here, which letter would you choose? You know one of them, right? So you can kind of mark out where did I say most deserts are found? What latitude? 30, yeah. So 30 we talked about. So we'll ignore B and D. We know it's not 60 and 90. So it'd be 0 and 30 or 30 and 90.
So like 0 was like the tropics, so it would be 30.
Exactly. So 0 is the equator. We don't have deserts really. Well, there are actually a couple of deserts, tiny ones at the equator. 30 and 90 are where most of the deserts are found. 90 degrees are the poles. Those are polar deserts. It's weird to think about the poles as deserts, but desert is defined by the amount of precipitation. They don't get much precipitation. They're extremely, they have extremely low precipitations, even though they have a covering of snow and ice. They just don't get a whole lot additionally. So 30 and 90 is where you get 30, you get the typical deserts that we think of, say the southwestern US, the Sahara. Polar deserts are at the poles, also very dry. And that's driven by those cells primarily, the polar and the Hadley cells. Okay, let's talk about surface wind patterns. These have more of an effect from what we see, I would say. So if you were going to try to predict what's going to happen in Demarest tomorrow, would you look towards the west or would you look towards the east? Where is the weather coming from?
The east. Our weather usually comes from the west.
Typically west. So there is some, so tropical depressions will come from the east, right? They develop because of the Hadley cells. There's a lot of heating up in that area. And then it also gets into ocean circulation, which we'll talk about in a minute, but weather patterns come from the west to the east across the US, right? We generally look what's happening in Texas and a little bit north of there. It's going to come down and hit us in a day or two, right? That is because of surface wind patterns. So this is where we get into another variable in the equation for weather, and it is called the Coriolis effect. Okay, so we would expect, based on the Hadley cells, we'd expect air to just move directly north and south, right? That's kind of what I was showing. That's not how it works because our Earth is spinning. So the Earth is spinning under the air that's moving north and south. This gets a little difficult to wrap your head around. So I'm going to try to, like I said, do my best to explain it and hopefully you understand. And I think this video, I haven't tested the sound in here. Hopefully we have some sound. I think this video is really helpful. Okay, so the Coriolis effect just says that objects are going to be deflected when they move toward or away from the equator. So if we're talking about the Hadley cells that start at the equator, air is going to be moving north and south, right, away from them. But it doesn't go directly north and south. This is the intended path. But because the Earth is spinning underneath that air that's moving, we see the pattern as it moving kind of off to the right. That's the idea behind the Coriolis effect. Our Earth is spinning as air is moving north, so that makes it look like the air is kind of deflected on the surface of the Earth to us. We're looking up at it. Think of it that way. Yeah, like a plane. So exactly, when planes are flying across the globe, they don't go exactly as you would expect them to go, right? Flight patterns are different. Yeah, good analogy. Okay, so let me see if this sound works.
Okay, so we know the Earth is spinning on its axis, and this spin has implications in direction of the wind. We call this Coriolis. Now, you may have heard of the Coriolis effect.
Let me see if I can turn the volume up here.
Coriolis force. But this is not a real force, it's what we call an apparent force. It all depends on your point of view, whether you're looking down from above or, like most of us are, on the Earth, looking from below upwards. Now, this is quite a complicated sounding business, but I've got a simple experiment to show it here. Chopping board, we've got a disc of paper, pins to that chopping board, a ruler, and a pen. I'm also going to need a little bit of assistance, so Helen is joining me, and she's going to spin the disc of paper as if it was the Earth, as if we were looking down from the North Pole, from above the North Pole. That means you need to rotate that disc anti-clockwise. I'm going to draw a straight line along the ruler as Helen rotates that. And just look at what happens. The spin of the Earth means that that straight line is not straight. If you were looking from here, you'd see that the winds will be bending round to the right. That is Coriolis in action in the northern hemisphere. If it was the southern hemisphere, we were looking from below the South Pole, we would spin the disc the other way, clockwise. Try that at home, and you will see that the winds bend the other way, to the left. Now, you may have heard that Coriolis makes the water spin down plug holes in different directions in different hemispheres. That turns out to actually be a bit of a myth. Plug holes are just too small a scale for Coriolis to really have any impact. But it is the reason why low pressure systems, tropical storms rotate anti-clockwise in the northern hemisphere, but clockwise in the southern hemisphere.
I had never heard anti-clockwise before I watched that video. Silly Brits. And plug holes. I'm like, what is a plug hole? I assume they mean like a toilet or a sink, but yeah. So that does explain, which I won't go into a lot of detail of, but you'll see tropical storms rotating, like you said, clockwise and counterclockwise, depending on the hemisphere that they're in, northern or southern. So hopefully that really simple experiment kind of helped explain that. Yeah, it just looks like the winds are moving one direction or another. So if we look at the overall globe, the Coriolis effect, you can predict which way it's going to look like the wind is blowing. So let's break this down. We'll focus on the northern hemisphere right now. The wind is always going to be blowing or looking like it's blowing to the right. So we'll start here. This is the easiest explanation. So kind of in our area. The Coriolis effect is going to show that wind is blowing kind of up and to the right, so northeast. Those are called the westerlies. You don't need to know these names, northeast trades and the westerlies and all of those. So is this blowing to the right or to the left? This is the part that always confused me. It looks like it's blowing to the left, right? From our perspective. The arrow is pointing to the left. So, but it's still considered to the right. So it's still blowing to the right because you're imagining you're the wind. So this is the starting point. It's going to the right. It's going south and to the right. So southwest. So it's blowing to the right here. It's blowing to the right here. It just looks from our perspective like opposite directions, which is a little bit strange. And then it would be the opposite in the south, the southern hemisphere. So in the northern hemisphere, as I noted down here, winds are deflected to the right. In the southern hemisphere, winds are deflected to the left. It's important to remember that the starting point, if it's right or left, is where the wind is starting. So I always imagine it at the base of the arrow. So here it's going left. If you're the wind, you're starting here, that's going right. Even though it looks from our perspective like it's going left, the wind is deflected to the right of itself. It wants to be going south, but it gets deflected off to the right. Okay. So what I might ask you here on an exam is I might give you a diagram and ask you to draw in arrows as to which way the wind would be blowing in these different bands. So 0 to 30, 30 to 60, northern and southern hemisphere. So I definitely want you to be able to remember those general patterns. Like I said, you don't need to worry about the names of those different winds. Okay, that's the Coriolis effect. So the Coriolis effect in the Hadley circulation trips people up a lot and can get confusing. Hopefully it made sense today. If you go back and look at it and you're like, wait, what were we talking about? I'll definitely review this before the next exam or before the first exam. So we'll come back to it. Okay, one last thing. We combine, like I said, both of these are at play, right? It's not like only the Hadley cells or only the Coriolis effect. You combine them. And that's what really, among other things, creates this really complex climate patterns that we see across the globe. I don't remember how long this is. Let's see. We have 5 minutes. I don't think it's longer than 5 minutes, but we'll see how both of these kind of combine to create generally what we see in a more complicated sense.
Realtor.com's new collaboration tools made it easy for Romeo and I to find the
Maybe we're not going to watch it. Maybe we'll watch it.
In this animation, we're going to look at global wind patterns.
So this is a boring video, but he does a really good job of explaining the combination of these. So
Patterns and talk about the
only
reasons
2 minutes.
why the air circulates the way it does, and also patterns of rising and sinking air and how that relates to precipitation. The engine that drives it all, I guess you could say, is the intense heating by the sun that occurs only in the equator areas where the sun is shining at a very high angle of incidence. And this hot air near the equator, being less dense, rises upward. It rises upward and it moves toward the poles, and then it gradually sinks at about 30 degrees north and south latitude. So we create these big spinning circles of air that we call the Hadley cells. Now, near the equator where the air is rising, it loses its ability to hold moisture, and you get a band of high rainfall and low pressure because there's air leaving the equator. Where the air sinks, in these, it belts at around 30 degrees north and south. You get high pressure sinking air, which creates areas of clear skies and desert climates. Now, as this air circulates and tries to flow back toward the equator along the surface of the Earth, whereas some of it heads toward the North Pole or toward the South Pole. The Coriolis effect, the spin of the Earth, causes it to bend and turn, and it's going to create the two big wind belts that prevail on our Earth, 2 out of 3. The trade winds, northeast trade winds and southeast trade winds, and then the prevailing westerlies. Now these winds curve, and the way they do because of the Coriolis effect. The winds curve to the right of their path, north of the equator. They curve to the left of their path, south of the equator, and they end up flowing from east to west or from west to east. Now, the other big factor is what's happening at the poles. At the poles, the air is cold and the cold air wants to sink. And as that cold polar air sinks, it heads toward the equator and it bumps into this air heading toward the pole here and toward the south pole here. And it creates an area of rising air. And again, rising air produces high precipitation belts at about 60 degrees north and about 60 degrees south latitude. At the poles themselves, the precipitation is quite modest because the air is sinking and that creates low precipitation.
Like I said, boring, but I kind of like all those moving arrows. So at 60 degrees, like you said, there's other rainforests occur up there too. They're temperate rainforests typically. So that's where all that moisture comes from. All right, we'll finish that up on Tuesday. I'll see y'all on Tuesday.